What's up, everybody? Today I'm going to be talking about the evolution of the Sony PlayStation controller, all the way from 1994 up till the modern day. I guess it goes up to 2020 because I don't have the DualSense Edge controller, and that's not a main series controller. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about the mainline controllers. There were a lot of other things that came out, like there's the PlayStation Move controller, there's the Buzz like game show controller, there's the Guitar Hero controller, there's stuff like that, but I'm not going to be talking about those. I'll just be talking about the original ones that shipped with the system. Starting off in 1994, Sony released their original PlayStation 1 controller. What this is it's got a D-pad, it's got start and select, it's got 4 buttons on the right, 2 buttons on each side, R1, R2, L1, L2, and 2 grips. And what you'll notice is that this is basically a Super Nintendo controller. Yeah, basically the exact same layout. The symbology is a little bit different, but it's still, 4 buttons on the right, start, select, D-pad. The only real difference is the Super Nintendo controller has only 2 shoulder buttons, and the PlayStation 1 controller has 4. The PlayStation 1 controller also has grips, and the Super Nintendo controller doesn't, but the Super Nintendo controller is called the dog bone controller, and Sony really made it look like a dog bone. Like, this is perfectly shaped like one if you take the handles off. So, this came out in 1994 in December, and a year and a half later, in June of 1996, Nintendo released the Nintendo 64. Now, the Nintendo 64 was their answer to the PlayStation 1 and the Sega Saturn. There was Nintendo's 5th generation console, and it had this newfangled thing called an analog stick. Sony needed to up the ante. In April 1997, they released the PlayStation 1 dual analog controller. Now, this is not the DualShock 1. The DualShock 1 comes out a little bit later. This was only out for about half a year, and yeah, it was just their way of putting analog sticks on their controller. That's literally what it is. They just threw it on. And yeah, the only other thing they changed is, well, the grips are a little bit longer, and that's to compensate for the lack of real estate here now because of the thumbsticks. Yeah, the sticks are a little longer. It added analog sticks, obviously, and now the buttons are shaped a little differently. Now, instead of 2 buttons on each side that are all the same shape and size on the shoulders, now these ones are a little bit bigger, which is kind of nice to differentiate the two. The dual analog controller wasn't out for very long, a couple months. Actually, before I move on to the DualShock, I do want to say that this is actually, even though this was kind of like an answer to Nintendo, this is fairly innovative. This was the first controller out that had 2 analog sticks. Even though they did copy the analog stick idea from Nintendo, it's still, I would say, a fairly innovative thing. But where they really started to innovate was when they released the DualShock 1, or I guess just the DualShock. It's the same as the dual analog controller. One change that I don't like is that they made the grips a little bit shorter. So for me, it doesn't really fit my hands as well as this one. This one fits a lot better because the grips are longer, but they shortened up the grips. The thumbsticks are a little bit different. They don't feel the same. This is like more of a rubber, and this is like a hard plastic. This is also convex, and the dual analog is concave. If you can see that on the analog sticks there. Yeah, there were these little ridges here, and they got rid of them on these, but yeah, the DualShock 1. What the DualShock 1 really added, though, is in the handles, there are 2 motors that vibrate along with however it's programmed into whatever game you're playing. So this, I think, was one of the biggest ways that Sony really innovated, because having that sort of physical feedback while you're playing the game really does, immerse you into the gameplay, so to speak. Moving on to the year 2000, when Sony released the PlayStation 2 and also the DualShock 2, which came out with it. I don't think there's really any difference between these two. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention, all of these Sony controllers have the same proprietary Sony plug. All of them have this. All of the consoles were doing these proprietary type deals with their plugs, so this isn't anything special necessarily, but yeah, this is, I'll show you on the DualShock 2 here. This is their proprietary plug, the Sony one. But yeah, so this is basically the exact same thing as the DualShock 1. I don't think there's really any difference. Yeah, I mean, they look exactly the same. I tried to go with the default colors that these controllers would have by default come out with, like when they were packaged with the system, for example. So the only real big difference when switching to the DualShock 2 is that the default color is now black. So this is the controller that came with the system was black. Before that, with the PS1, all the controllers were this kind of off-white, beigey gray color, which kind of sucked because, you know, back then people smoked a lot more and that would ruin the color of them. But with black, that doesn't actually happen as much. This one I definitely have a lot of nostalgia for. This is a console that I grew up with, was the PS2, so. But yeah. Then moving on to the year 2006, when Sony released their next console. And with it came, well, the 6-axis was what came first. I have here the DualShock 3. Now, the DualShock 3 and the 6-axis look exactly the same. They're the exact same controller in like the way they look. The only difference is, instead of saying DualShock 3 and 6-axis, the 6-axis controller would just say 6-axis right here. And so the 6-axis was out for 2 years after the release of the PS3 in 2006. And then in 2008, they released the DualShock 3. The only difference between the two is that the DualShock 3 has the motors in the handles, which allows it to vibrate, makes it a little bit heavier. Besides that, they're exactly the same. I don't know why Sony didn't release their DualShock 3 immediately, because, I mean, DualShock 1 and 2, I don't know, it seemed like almost a mistake or something, but they did eventually come out with the DualShock 3. And, well, what are the differences between this and the DualShock 2? Well, first of all, this analog button has been swapped out with a home button. This is going to obviously bring you home. It's going to connect the controller to the system because now it also has wireless capability. It's not wired anymore, and it takes mini USB, which at the time was pretty nice because it's, you know, a universal cable that you could find in a lot of places, and it's fairly small data cable. But nowadays, mini USB is pretty hard to come by. Even micro USB is kind of getting hard to come by nowadays, but mini USB especially. But yeah, they didn't really change much else. Oh, 6-axis, what is that? Now it has motion controls, so it can tell, it has a gyroscope in it, so you can tell which way you're moving the controller. There's only one game I know of that really uses the 6-axis controls, and that's called Lair. And they work fine. I know a lot of people kind of make fun of the 6-axis controls and say that they don't work well. I honestly think it's fairly innovative. It's not used by a lot of games, but you know, in Lair, when you swipe up, that's a dragon riding game, like a dog-fighting dragon game where you dogfight on dragons. And when you swipe up, the dragon flips around. When you steer like this, the dragon goes to the right. And when you steer like that, it goes to the left. I mean, the 6-axis controls work fine. I don't know. People give it a lot of crap. I think they work fine. I think it's a much less gimmicky implementation of motion controls than like what the Wii does, for example, at this time. But one thing I will say about it is, for whatever reason, they messed up the thumbsticks. Like, the thumbsticks on this thing just feel really bad. Oh, you know what else they added to the DualShock 3? Triggers. You see on the DualShock 2, these were still buttons. But in the DualShock 3, they finally turned them into triggers. And this is obviously just a response to Xbox, because the original Xbox and the 360 both had triggers there too. The problem is, though, that PlayStation didn't implement these very well. These feel really mushy. I don't really know how to describe it unless you like touch it in person. That's the only way you can really know what I'm talking about, but these feel super, super mushy, especially compared to the Xbox triggers. But, you know, I would definitely prefer having triggers over not having triggers, so oh well. Yeah, one thing I also haven't mentioned, and this goes for every single controller prior to this and this one, is that these start and select buttons have this like nice rubbery texture. I don't know how to describe it either. It's It's also something you kind of have to touch in person, but it's got this very like interesting texture that I kind of like, and this is going to unfortunately be the last time that you see this, because in 2013 Sony came out with the DualShock 4 along with the PlayStation 4. Now this is the first major redesign. If you noticed, all the ones prior to this kind of looked pretty similar. This is the first time that they really like changed the shape of it. I mean, look at the difference between these two, especially compared to the last couple. But it's really not that big of a difference. Like the design, it's still the, you know, basic dog bone design with the two sticks here. They added a touchpad so that obviously there's not enough room here for just to throw a touchpad in, so they had to add more up here to make room for it. And then they made the grips way better. The grips are longer, they fit to the hands better. Just, yeah, they fixed the grips there. They changed the start and select button, which I don't like. This was one of the biggest things I didn't like about the DualShock 4 when it came out, was these options and share button that are the exact same size and shape, and then they also are just now plastic. They're pretty clicky, which is nice, but I definitely prefer these old rubber, like this rubber type of thing with you know, the unique shapes. I definitely prefer that. Yeah, I don't really know who's using this share button. The options button is just a pause button, but yeah, I don't know. They added this touchpad, which isn't really used in a lot of games, to be honest with you. I don't know. I used my PS4 back in the day to play a lot of Skyrim, and it definitely wasn't used there, and it just isn't used in a lot of games in general. To this day, I don't know. I don't really see a point in the touchpad. It doesn't seem to be used as much as you'd think. This still has the 6-axis motion controls, just like the DualShock 3 did. It added a speaker here. It does not have a microphone, but it does have a speaker right here where you can hear game sounds out of. And what else? Oh, now it is switched. The PS3 was mini USB, and now the PS4, if I can show it on camera, is now micro USB, which is definitely an upgrade from mini USB, I would say. But, you know, micro USBs are kind of on their way out now, so it does feel a tad dated at this point, but not too bad. A little headset jack, which is pretty nice. The triggers are a huge improvement over the PS3 triggers. These are mushy. The DualShock 4 has really nice, like, very springy triggers that work really nice. Yeah, they also have this light bar here, which doesn't really have a purpose, but you can use it as a flashlight. It's so bright. I remember like sitting in my room at night and the lights are off, and I turn on my PS4 and this thing just lights up the whole room. Like it's so bright, this light bar. I'm not sure why that's a thing. Yeah, overall, this is definitely an improvement. The grips are so nice. It just fits in the hand a lot better than the previous controllers, but just a few changes I didn't really like, and the touchpad that doesn't really seem to have a use all that much. But overall, I'd say this is an improvement over the previous, as if I'm reviewing this or something. Moving on to just a little bit over 2 years ago at this point, and Sony released the DualSense. Yeah, I know, not a DualShock, the DualSense. Obviously, you can see they changed the default color to white. It was black from PS2 to PS4, but now it is white. So changing that up again. I don't know. They changed up the grip again. I'm trying to decide. I think I like the PS4's grip a little bit better, but this is still an improvement over the PS3, PS2, PlayStation 1, I think. Yeah, I don't know. It's a very similar design. Obviously, they changed up kind of the whole shape of it again, but it's still, you know, in the middle, it's still the basic dog bone design with these. Obviously, the touchpad's still here. The triggers are again like the PS4 ones. In fact, I think they're really the exact same. Yeah, they're very, very similar. But that's fine. That's good because they're good triggers. There's nothing wrong with them. Now the PlayStation button is instead of being a circle like it was on PS4 and 3, like a little kind of glossy circle, now it is the PlayStation symbol. Also, they added a microphone, so it still has the speaker like the PS4 does, or the DualShock 4, but now it has a microphone as well, so you can talk into it. What else? They got rid of that dang light bar. Now it is USB-C instead of micro USB, which is super nice. I love USB-C, and it's everywhere now, so it's really easy to find cables for it. It's great. From the DualShock 4 all the way back, they had these colored buttons, and it's, the iconic blue X, or sorry, that's blue cross, orange circle, pink square, and green triangle. They got rid of the colors, and that's kind of sad. And they also kept these sort of little buttons. I kind of wish they would bring back the rubber ones, but oh well. But the single biggest thing, and the reason why this is called a DualSense controller, not a DualShock, is that now instead of just 2 motors in the handles, they have little motors all throughout the entire controller that vibrate at different intensities. And so now, instead of just rumble, now it is haptic feedback, which it's super hard to describe how it feels when there's a game that has haptics like really well implemented. But honestly, Astro's Playroom on the PS5 is one of the most refined gaming, possibly the most refined gaming experience you can have. And it's all because of the haptic feedback. It's so hard to describe. There's a part where you're like on this kind of gear thing, and as you tilt the controller and move the gear, you can hear this little like ticking, and it feels like you're like winding up. I can't even describe it. It's so hard to put into words, but it really does feel like your hands are feeling what's going on in the game because of how refined the motors are in here. The one thing also that it has is it added adaptive triggers. There are certain parts of games where it'll make the trigger a little bit harder to pull, so it has like more resistance to it. And there's a whole range of that, to like very resistant to just loose, like this is. And then it also can add a little like click in there. So when you get to like about the halfway point, all of a sudden it clicks to go to the rest of the way. The adaptive triggers are super cool and also really help with the immersion. But yeah, that's the DualSense. Still, I don't know what the purpose of the touchpad is. I don't really know. I don't know how much that's gonna stick, but we'll see. I think maybe with the Steam Deck kind of pushing the touchpad thing too, maybe it'll stick a little bit more, as well as the haptic feedback. But yeah, I mean, that's gonna do it. Here to here is just it's really quite the thing to see, the whole evolution of it. But yeah, let me know what your favorite PlayStation controller is. And yeah, peace out.